The sun beat down mercilessly over the cracked earth of Hallow County, turning the auction grounds into a shimmering wave of heat and dust. Cowboys in faded hats leaned against wooden rails, murmuring, bargaining, waiting. In the center stood a powerful chestnut stallion, tall, scarred, and still as stone. His name wasn't on the auction sheet, but his presence felt familiar, almost sacred. He stared ahead, unblinking, as if he remembered every face in the crowd. They called him Lot 27, but that wasn't his name. Not really. Just as the auctioneer, a thick-voiced man named Buck, raised his gavel to start the bidding, a scream tore through the air. Sharp, wild. Two girls burst from the edge of the arena, barefoot, with hair tangled like wind-blown straw and dresses coated in dust. The younger one, Zara Flint, shouted loud enough to stop the world. "Don't sell that horse," she cried. "That horse carries the body of our father." Silence fell like a stone. Every head turned. The crowd froze, eyes darting between the girls and the stallion. The older twin, Teslyn Crow, stood firm beside her sister, her lip trembling but her voice clear. "We know that horse. His name is Willowfang, and he didn't come alone." The stallion turned his head then, slowly, deliberately, and looked straight at them. Recognition flickered in his eyes, something too deep for words. Sheriff Malric Hallow, now half-retired but still feared and respected, stepped forward from the outer ring of the crowd. "Whose children are these?" he asked, scanning the girls. Zara didn't blink. "We're the daughters of Draven Coltmore." That name sent a ripple through the crowd. Coltmore had vanished over a year ago, no trace, no blood. Only his horse had disappeared with him, until now. Buck's hand slowly lowered the gavel. "That horse, he was supposed to be dead," someone muttered. Sheriff Hallow narrowed his eyes. "You girls say the horse came back to you?" Teslyn nodded. 2 nights ago. He showed up at our ranch. Same scar on his leg. Same saddle Daddy rode the night he disappeared. And he took us to something buried beneath the old oak line." She swallowed hard. "We saw our father's belt buckle. And bones. No one moved. Even the dust seemed to hang in midair." Sheriff Hallow looked again at the stallion, Willowfang, whose chest rose and fell slowly, eyes locked on the twins like a silent guardian. The crowd didn't speak. They didn't laugh. Because deep down, they knew, something buried had just started to rise. And the Coltmore family was far from finished. Sheriff Malric Hallow didn't speak as he led the girls out of the auction ring. His boots crunched against the gravel while the eyes of the entire town followed them. Willowfang walked behind them without reins or resistance, steady, quiet, like he had done this walk before. People made way, but no one dared to speak his name. There was a weight in the air now, thick with buried years and things unsaid. They stopped near the sheriff's truck, parked beside a faded barn. "Start from the beginning," Hallow said, arms crossed. Teslyn looked to her sister, but Zara took a step forward. "He came out of the woods at dusk. Just standing there. Saddle dirty, rope loose. His leg had that same scar Daddy always talked about. He wouldn't let anyone touch him, except us." Her voice trembled. "He waited for us, then walked to the trees. We followed him." Teslyn chimed in, her tone sharper. "He led us to the ravine, behind the oak line. There's this hollow spot where the dirt's softer, like something was dug up or buried. We saw metal shining. It was our father's belt buckle, the one Mama gave him after the war." Her hands balled into fists. "You don't forget something like that." Sheriff Hallow's expression darkened. He remembered that buckle too, silver-plated, engraved with D.C. for Draven Coltmore. Rettelin Scorn had shown it to him once, years ago, before she vanished. Hallow glanced at the horse again. Willowfang was staring into the trees beyond the fence, ears twitching, as if he heard something none of them could. The sheriff had been a man of reason his entire life, but in that moment he felt something stir inside him, something old and cold. "I need to see that place," he finally said. "You'll take me there. Now." The girls nodded without hesitation. But just as they turned to get in the truck, Willowfang let out a low, breathy whinny, not loud, but strained like a warning. He didn't move, just lowered his head, almost in mourning. Zara stepped toward him and placed her small hand on his neck. "He doesn't want us to go alone," she whispered. Hallow hesitated, but then opened the trailer behind his truck. "He comes with us," he said. "If this horse knows the way, I'm damn well letting him lead it." As the trailer door creaked open, the wind shifted suddenly, carrying the scent of ash, old ash. And for just a second, Hallow thought he heard it, a man's voice, distant and broken, whispering his name from the trees. The truck bounced over the uneven dirt road that led toward the forgotten edges of the Coltmore property. Weeds pushed through cracks in the fence line, and the oak trees ahead rose like silent witnesses to old sins. The girls sat quietly in the back seat, hands folded tight in their laps, eyes fixed ahead. In the trailer behind them, Willowfang stood unmoving, as if he, too, remembered the land they were approaching. Sheriff Malric Hallow pulled to a stop just short of the tree line. As the engine clicked into silence, only the wind remained, soft, carrying the faint scent of pine and decay. "This is it," Teslin said, already pushing open the door. "He took us here." The sheriff followed, one hand resting on the grip of his revolver, not out of fear of danger, but habit, the kind you develop when the ground beneath you no longer feels honest. They walked about 50 feet into the brush until they reached a dip in the earth, a shallow ravine, dry and shadowed by the canopy above. Zara knelt beside a patch of disturbed soil. "Right here," she said, voice barely above a breath. It was sticking out, right there. She pointed to a patch where the dirt looked darker, softer. Sheriff Hallow crouched down and cleared away a thin layer of leaves and dust. Within seconds, metal caught the light. A tarnished belt buckle, its silver dulled by time, stared back at them from beneath the soil. The engraving was still clear, D.C. The sheriff froze. He had seen Draven wear that buckle nearly every Sunday at church, even after the war had made him half a man. "No one else would have had this," he muttered. But it wasn't just the buckle. As he dug deeper, his hand struck something harder, smoother. A rib bone, too large for an animal, emerged like a secret pulled from the earth. Teslin stepped back, trembling. "We didn't dig more. We were scared." Hallow nodded slowly, pulling a handkerchief from his coat. He covered the bone gently, almost with reverence. "You did right." He stood, suddenly aware of the deepening shadows around them. "No one else knows you came out here?" Both girls shook their heads. "Good. We keep it that way, for now." Behind them, Willowfang stood just outside the trees, eyes locked on the sight, his breath slow and heavy. Sheriff Hallow turned to the horse. "You led them here. Why?" The stallion didn't move, but the look in his eyes sent a chill through the sheriff's spine. It wasn't fear. It was waiting for what would be uncovered next. By the time Sheriff Hallow secured the site and got the girls back home, the sun was slipping below the horizon, casting long blood-red shadows across the hills. The belt buckle, now sealed in an evidence bag, lay heavy in the glove compartment like it carried its own heartbeat. But something about it gnawed at him. If that was Draven Coltmore's grave, why hadn't anyone come looking sooner? Why had the town, himself included, moved on so quickly? Back at his office, Hallow poured himself a glass of bourbon and pulled out the old file labeled Coltmore, Draven. It was thinner than it should have been. A missing persons report. A few statements. One anonymous tip claiming Draven had simply walked away. No body. No investigation. No urgency. The sheriff ran a hand down his face. "We buried a man's memory and called it closure," he muttered. But Draven Coltmore wasn't just any man. He was the son of Joseph Coltmore, a name still spoken with clenched jaws in Hallow County. Joseph had ruled the family ranch with fear, pride, and fists. The fire that took him, and supposedly the stallion Willowfang, had been called accidental, but no one truly believed that. And now, with Willowfang alive and a body buried under Coltmore Ridge, the whispers were returning. Whispers of what Joseph had done, and what Draven may have inherited. Rettelin Scorn had known. If anyone had ever understood the depths of Draven, it was her. She'd left town a decade ago, after the house fire that supposedly claimed her life. But Sheriff Hallow had always questioned that story. No body had been found. Just burned wood, scorched clothes, and silence. When Zara and Teslin called out Draven's name at the auction, something in Hallow's gut twisted, not because of what they said, but because of how they said it. He remembered Rettelin's eyes, sharp, cold, unreadable. The way she used to ride beside Draven, whispering things no one else could hear. People in town said she was cursed, a woman who saw death before it happened. When she vanished, no one searched for long. Just like they hadn't searched for Draven. It was easier that way. Some names were too heavy to carry. Some truths too dangerous to dig up. But now the ground had cracked open. Willowfang had returned. The girls had spoken. And Joseph Coltmore's legacy, whatever it truly was, had started to bleed through the soil. Sheriff Hallow sat back in his chair, staring at the file. He didn't need the town's permission anymore. He needed answers. Because deep down, he feared this was only the first body. Willowfang stood alone in the sheriff's paddock, head low, his breath steady but deep. Sheriff Hallow watched him from the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand. The scars on the horse's leg were unmistakable, the same ones he'd seen 20 years ago, when the barn went up in flames and Joseph Coltmore was presumed dead. Willowfang was believed to have died that night too. But here he was, flesh and blood, staring into the fog like he'd galloped straight out of a ghost story. Hallow had been a deputy back then. He remembered the flames, how fast they climbed, how loud Joseph had screamed. No one found a full body, just fragments, and no sign of the horse. The blaze had been blamed on faulty lanterns. But some whispered that Draven had done it. That he'd finally snapped after years of beatings and humiliation. Hallow never found proof, just scorched ground and silence. And now, with the horse back and a body buried under Coltmore Ridge, the old suspicions had come roaring back. The sheriff took a slow breath and walked toward the fence. Willowfang lifted his head, meeting his gaze. There was an intelligence in those eyes, not human, not magical, but something aware. Like the horse remembered who had watched and who had stayed silent. Hallow felt it deep in his bones. "You walked through fire once," he muttered. "What the hell brought you back now?" That same morning, word of the auction incident had spread through the county. Half the town thought the girls were lying. The other half didn't want to find out if they weren't. But one person did show up, a figure Hallow hadn't seen in over a decade. Rettelin Scorn. She stepped out of a black pickup just as the sheriff was heading back inside. Same silver eyes. Same long black coat. Like no time had passed at all. "I heard he came back," she said, eyes locked on Willowfang. "I knew he would." Hallow stared at her, stunned. "You're supposed to be dead." She didn't flinch. So was he. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the breeze moving through the trees and Willowfang's slow exhale. Then Rettelin turned toward the paddock. "If that horse found the body, he'll find the truth too," she said quietly. "But the truth never shows up alone, Sheriff. It always drags something worse behind it." Sheriff Hallow hadn't let anyone near the burial site. He'd called in favors for quiet lab analysis, sent the girls back under Sorrel Knox's watch, and locked every piece of evidence in the old jail's cellar. But with Retelin's scorn alive, standing in his office like a ghost with unfinished business, everything had shifted. The line between past and present was no longer clear. She sat across from him, her hands folded neatly on the desk. Her eyes, cold and unreadable, seemed to carry the weight of every sin ever whispered in Hallow County. "It wasn't Joseph in that fire," she said calmly. "It was someone else. Draven knew. That's why he disappeared." The words struck like a match. Sheriff Hallow leaned forward. "Then who was it?" Retelin hesitated, then looked down. "You don't want that answer. But I'll tell you this. Joseph Coltmore didn't die. He changed his name and buried himself inside the town. He lived among you, long enough to twist Draven into something he swore he'd never become." Meanwhile, Sorrel Knox had taken Zara and Tess Lynn to stay in their guest house, a rustic, weather-worn structure filled with old paintings and strange, half-finished sculptures. The girls wandered the narrow hallways, silently drawn to a door at the end of the house. Inside, they found a series of canvases stacked against the walls. Each painting showed something familiar: the ridge, the ravine, and Willowfang. But one stopped them cold, a portrait of their father, painted years ago, standing next to a burned oak tree, with no face. "That tree," Tess Lynn whispered. "It's the one by the hollow." Zara touched the canvas. Her breath hitched. "We were here. But I don't remember when." The memories were returning in fragments. Smoke, yelling, someone pulling them away in the night. Sorrel entered quietly and stood behind them. "I painted these before the fire," they said gently. "Before you two forgot everything." Back at the sheriff's office, Retelin rose to leave. "You buried too many truths, Malric," she said. "This town's been living on ashes for 20 years. You think it's over because the fire went out? It's only beginning." As she stepped outside, Willowfang lifted his head again from the paddock and let out a long, low sound. Not quite a whinny, not quite a growl. Sheriff Hallow watched her go, heart pounding, because deep down he knew something was coming. And it was no longer content to stay buried. The night was heavier than usual. Clouds blotted out the stars, and the wind moved through the trees like it was searching for something. Inside Sorrel Knox's guest house, Zara Flint tossed in her bed, eyes wide open. Across the room, Tess Lynn Crow slept curled tightly, murmuring in her sleep. Something was pulling Zara, not physically, but from deep inside, like an invisible thread tugging her toward the past. She slipped out of bed and stepped barefoot onto the wooden floor. The air was colder than it should have been. Quietly, she moved through the hallway, her fingers brushing the framed sketches that lined the walls. Willowfang's eyes appeared in nearly every one. Watching. Waiting. When she reached the back door, it was already slightly ajar, creaking as it moved in the breeze. Outside, the barn stood still under the moonless sky. Zara walked toward it slowly, heart pounding louder with every step. The doors, warped and faded, opened with a soft groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust, wood rot, and something else, old smoke. The kind that doesn't go away, no matter how many years pass. In the far corner, beneath a collapsed beam, lay an old saddle. She didn't know why, but she recognized it. Her small hands reached out to touch the leather. The moment she did, a whisper floated through the rafters. "Zara." She froze. The voice wasn't imagined. It was real, low and gravelly, like it came from the walls. She spun around, eyes scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" she whispered. No answer. Just the creak of wood and the wind brushing the eaves. Then she saw it, a shadow moving across the loft above. Not human. Not animal. It disappeared in the blink of an eye, leaving behind a sudden rush of memory. Her father yelling, her mother dragging them through the woods, the barn engulfed in flames. Suddenly, Teslin was behind her, barefoot and wide-eyed. "I had a dream," she whispered. "We were here, and Daddy was yelling at someone. Not Mama. Someone else. A man with a cane." Zara turned to her sister, tears forming in her eyes. "I think we saw something we weren't supposed to." From outside the barn came the unmistakable sound of hooves on gravel. The girls ran to the door and saw Willowfang standing just beyond the tree line, staring at them like he'd been waiting. But this time there was someone beside him, a man in a dark coat, too far to make out. And then, just like that, the figure vanished into the trees. Sheriff Malric Hallow didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his office, surrounded by half-drunk coffee and folders that had gathered more dust than answers. Retelin's words haunted him. Joseph Coltmore didn't die. He buried himself in the town. That couldn't be true. Or maybe it always had been, and no one wanted to believe it. He opened a drawer and pulled out a box of old case files, the ones labeled "closed," though none of them ever felt that way. One name stood out: Raymond Creed, a rancher who moved into the outskirts of Hallow County shortly after Joseph's death. No family, no history, paid for the land in cash. Friendly enough to the townsfolk, but never close. Malric hadn't thought twice about him in years. But now, looking at his faded photo in the permit file, his heart dropped. The eyes. The jawline. Too close to Joseph to be coincidence. At dawn, he drove out to the Creed property, or what was left of it. The house had been abandoned for weeks, maybe months. Windows broken. Tools rusted. But in the barn, he found something chilling. A wall covered in old photographs, newspaper clippings, and family records. In the center, pinned with rusted nails, was a photo of Draven Coltmore, a boy, maybe 15, with a black eye and split lip. Written across it in shaky ink, he knew. Sheriff Hallow's hands trembled. "You were hiding in plain sight, you bastard," he whispered. Back at Sorrel Knox's house, Zara and Teslin sat across from Retelin's scorn. The girls had questions. Too many. And now their mother had no choice but to answer. "Joseph was your grandfather," she began, voice low. "He was a cruel man. Draven tried to protect you from his legacy. That's why he changed the name. That's why he ran." Teslin stared hard. "But he didn't run, did he? He was taken." Retelin's eyes flickered. "Yes," she said, "because Joseph wasn't finished." The truth hit Zara like ice in her lungs. So Draven disappeared, not to hide, but to confront him? Retelin nodded. He thought he could end it. Bury it for good. Outside, the wind picked up. Willowfang paced the fence line, restless, as if he knew something was coming. Something that had waited years to return. That night, Sheriff Hallow stood alone outside the old Coltmore barn. He held the final piece of Joseph's identity in his hands. There was no doubt now. Joseph never left. He simply changed his face, and took his son with him. The Coltmore land had always been dry, cracked, and stubborn, as if it refused to grow anything that hadn't first tasted blood. Sheriff Hallow stood at the edge of the ravine with Retelin at his side, the sun barely rising. Zara and Teslin waited by the fence, silent, gripping each other's hands. A team of state investigators had finally arrived. Under the sheriff's orders, they began digging with care, but no one was ready for what they'd find. 2 graves. Not one. One held bones already exposed, presumed to be Draven Coltmore. The other, deeper, sealed in a rusted trunk buried beneath a layer of ash and charcoal. The coroner pried it open with gloved hands. Inside, clothing from another time, shattered ribs, and a revolver tucked between rotted leather belts. Retelin took one look and whispered, "Joseph." Sheriff Hallow nodded slowly. Then who the hell was Raymond Creed? Zara stepped forward, her voice quiet but certain. He wasn't just hiding. He was hunting. Watching us. From the moment Daddy disappeared, he was here. Waiting for us to grow up. Teslin added, he wanted us back in that house. To finish what he started with Draven. The sheriff's hands curled into fists. He'd seen evil wear many faces in his time. Smooth-talking salesmen, preachers with knives, fathers with belts. But Joseph Coltmore had been something worse, a man who turned blood into control. He raised hell, then buried it deep, Hallow muttered. And we let him. The evidence was undeniable now. Fingerprints, DNA, fragments of letters. Joseph had faked his death in the barn fire and reinvented himself as Raymond Creed. Draven had discovered it and paid the price. Rettelin had gone into hiding to protect the girls, knowing Joseph was still alive. She had planned to return once it was safe, but safety never came. It took Willowfang, the only living witness, to drag the past into daylight. As investigators hauled the second trunk from the dirt, the wind picked up suddenly. Willowfang reared up near the fence, letting out a sharp, guttural cry that echoed through the trees. Dust swirled around the ravine like a warning. Rettelin stepped beside her daughters, voice calm but firm. It ends today. No more running. No more silence. And as the sheriff looked down at the blood-stained soil beneath his boots, he realized something chilling. This land had never stopped bleeding. It had just grown quiet. The sun was sinking behind the hills of Hallow County, casting long shadows across the Coltmore land. The investigators were gone, the crowd had dispersed, but the silence remained. Sheriff Hallow stood at the edge of the ravine, staring at the fresh soil that now marked two graves. One for Draven Coltmore, a son who tried to break the cycle. The other for Joseph, a father who became his family's curse. There would be no ceremony. Just closure. And even that felt fragile. Willowfang stood nearby, motionless, as if waiting for something unspoken. Zara and Teslin approached him slowly, their small hands brushing his sides. The stallion didn't flinch. He looked tired, not from age, but from carrying truths no creature should. He brought us here, Zara whispered. He never left us. Rettelin joined them, her voice thick with emotion. Because your father didn't want to be forgotten. He wanted you to remember the good, not just the pain. Sheriff Hallow approached with a small leather pouch in hand. We found this near Draven's body. It's a journal, mostly torn and burned. But there's a page that survived. He handed it to Rettelin. She unfolded it with shaking fingers and read aloud, her voice cracking, "If I don't make it back, tell them I never ran. I stayed to protect them. I'd do it again. Tell Zara and Teslin to ride him, one last time. He'll know where to go." The girls looked at each other. Willowfang turned his head slowly, as if understanding every word. Without hesitation, they climbed onto his back together, just as they had when they were younger. Sheriff Hallow stepped back, unsure of what would happen next. Rettelin's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't stop them. "Go," she whispered. "Let him take you." Willowfang trotted off gently, then broke into a run, swift, graceful, like time falling away beneath his hooves. He carried them across the hills, past the burned oak, past the old fence line, and into the last light of day. And when they reached the ridge overlooking the valley, he stopped. The girls climbed down, breathless, and found a plaque embedded in stone, Draven Coltmore. A father. A fighter. A flame that never died. When they returned, the stallion didn't follow. Willowfang stood still at the edge of the ridge, watching them fade into the dusk. And then, like smoke carried on wind, he was gone. No tracks, no sound, just the memory of a horse who came back from fire, to finish what love had started.